This is the Internet Court of Truth and Lies, and what we do is we gather together some people to look at a claim that something is a truth or something is a lie, and we dissect the claim. The plaintiff provides a verdict which dissects the supposed truth or lie. Then each of the jurors answers the same questions for their verdicts. We essentially compare notes. There is no decision in the Internet Court of Truth and Lies as to whether or not something is true or a lie. What you get are different people's perspectives. And it turns out many times it's extremely instructive. The best way to be a plaintiff or a sponsor of trials is to have some questions where you're wondering what other people think is true, or whether you think that something is a lie and you want to see if other people think it's a lie too. And that's what the court does, is it lets people learn what other people think in a structured dialogue. This particular case is one based on a paper I wrote in 2019 after having attended a small invited-only conference of maybe 30 people around the world that were invited in by the president of Carnegie Mellon University to study hate. We had people who were practitioners trying to decrease or affect in positive sense the hate that's in the world in different countries. So we had probably of those 30 people, only 5 or 6 were actually from the United States. We had people from many different countries. And what typically these people do is they work to their educational systems so that they can nip destructive hate in the bud before the people grow up, basically. There were numerous studies that they were describing. This was like a 3-day conference where they could report on people who had gone through the process of essentially joining a cult and then successfully getting out of the cult later on. And all variations on it that you could possibly imagine. But that's who these people were. They were actually at this conference, they were the ones who were paid by different organizations. Only maybe half the people there were from universities. The rest were from governments and stuff that were in special organizations within governments. Anyway, I was asked to give a talk on the second day or something. And as is my normal way, I prepared 0 for the talk. And I gave a talk on paths of deceit, which I had made up as I was listening to the first day of the conference. The concept of a paths of deceit is a really simple concept. I think it's a very powerful concept. The idea is that we're all living on the earth, and deceit exists all around us as individuals. We may be the culprit, the one who lied purposefully or accidentally. We may be the person who got convinced and got caused to do something based on some deceit. We might be the person that's punishing the people who were engaged in some criminal behavior based on some internal deceit that they had cooked up among themselves, and so forth and so on. There's this idea that everybody's on the planet and we're moving around on the planet. And deceit typically, if you look historically, is a pretty local phenomenon. Deceit was as far as the horses would take you. And then when it came, deceit could get distributed over much larger kingdoms got created, emperors got created, and so forth and so on. Deceit could happen in much larger communities. And if you look at dictatorships and so forth, those are typically cults where the dictator is the cult leader. What these people were describing was this happens at the neighborhood level as well. In other words, you get a cult leader that can ruin the lives of a dozen people by forcing them through threats and so forth to engage into that protects that cult, theoretically, and they can get rich that way or whatever they do. So there's this notion of storms of deceit. What deceit, the way it works globally, is it's like the weather globally. If it's rained today on you, you're caught up in a path of rainfall that will get you wet or whatever. And you can be caught up in a bad way, you're just observing it, or you can whatever, but you get caught up in it. And so the idea of paths of deceit is that if you look at the globe and people on the globe, there are literally at any given point in time millions of paths of deceit going on around the globe. Principally, what these people were talking about in this conference was age. They were very interested because they knew that if they could get people to understand when they're engaged in a situation, destructive cult, early on, they may have been the child of somebody in the cult. They knew to get a hold of that person too. And they also had ways to characterize people who had been associated with cult members, but never actually got caught into the cult in different ways. So the other aspect of a path of deceit is it's a life path. And one of the things that they argued is that if you get caught into a cult early as a teenager, and remember that this is any cult where you wind up with a cult leader who's controlling the information. So typically what happens is within the cult, people tell the truth to each other, but they lie to the outside world. And the cult leader actually will define the limits on telling the truth to each other. That truth that they talked about to each other is often, in the most destructive cults, absolutely the truth. And it is the truth, but people on the outside just don't talk about it. And they talk about it, and then they feel special. It helps seal the cult off from the rest of the world because they will not discuss these truths to people on the outside, the ones that are keeping the cult alive, which is a really interesting set of things. But there's this life path thing. So, for example, one of the very common that basically most of the people with expertise in the conference said, these people from countries all over the world, they said that if you fall into a cult, pick an age, when you're 17, okay, and you get out of the cult when you're 24, but you didn't get out of it voluntarily, like your cult leader got killed or something, then you're likely to fall into another cult. But if you get out of it voluntarily while the cult is healthy and you survive getting out, you will probably never fall into another cult. And of the same, one of these really destructive cults, because you will have the danger that you would be in if you fall into this other cult. And often the cult starts the same way Plato said for the loss of democracy. It starts with a sort of an oligarchy, which is a group of people who pal around together. And then one person becomes their leader. And then that person seizes the opportunity to, through threats and so forth and so on, and these sort of internal truths and the need in order for the cult to survive, to keep the world not knowing what these internal truths are. And lying to the rest of the world. The cult seals itself up and moves forward and so forth. And that's what this is all about. The idea was, Court of Truth and Lies, was to develop a data source for paths of deceit, mapping paths of deceit, where we could look at supposed truths and lies and see what people said about them within certain contexts. Something that could generate data on this, because largely the work that has been done to date in all this did not have the internet working for them. Instead, the social media works against them. So one of the things that we discussed was also these storms that roll over the earth of deceit. Obviously, the internet can take the storm all the way around the world. So you're no longer limited to your country or to your local community or whatever. It could go all the way around the world. You want to have something other than social media where people are actually learning about things like passive deceit. But people learn best by dialogue with other people. They don't learn best by some instructor sitting there telling them how irrational thinking works, because they are within the cult perfectly rational. That's one of the properties that they noticed, is that within the context of the cult, people are truthful to each other. They're sometimes overly truthful, but they're truthful to each other, overly in the sense of being threatening. Truthfulness to the cult leader is required. Within the cult, truth prevails, but the cult as a whole is engaged in lying to the outside world, the integrity of the cult, pretending that they're something that they're not, pretending that the leader is a great man or whatever. That's what this is about. I gave the talk. Before I gave the talk, I'd actually written the first draft of this article just because it was that first day was so compelling to see this happen. That's my case. A path of deceit is a path over the globe of you. Everybody has his own paths of deceit. And so you could be anywhere on the globe. The paths of deceit will pass like storms passing over you no matter where you are. So if you're at one location and a certain type of storm passes over you, you may be caught in that storm. If you move to Japan, that storm may take 6 months to get over to Japan, but that same storm may roll over you in Japan. Or through social media, the storm may roll over the entire globe or all the areas that are not blocking the social media. We see this sort of thing happening all the time. The whole argument of the past is because you could probably apply the same prediction mechanisms that predict weather. You could probably build machines that could look at and tell where help is needed in a region because of the storms of deceit that are passing over that region, and categorizing those storms of deceit. So that was the whole idea of it. And my talk was well received and so forth and so on. This is the first time I've ever talked about this since I gave that talk. So I'm curious as to what other people think, but that's the explanation. So I'm going to go through my verdicts. I think everybody can see these things in their own lives. And it may be as simple as within your family and outside of your family and so forth, but they're there. Different people have different paths, and everybody has unique paths of deceit passing over them. Their lifeline, they may have different paths of deceit that actually affect them, and others that don't for different reasons and so forth and so on. So it's just like the weather. It's where you live and who you are that like what you have to worry about. So I said, yes, it's true. It's the whole truth. Unfortunately, this conference was not people who write papers. I'm sure somebody else wrote a paper but don't know who they were. So there was no published result of this conference. It was interesting. I've never really seen a conference like it. The president of the university did it for about 3 years, and he since died of a heart attack. Books could be written on this, but we really saw that books could be written on it because they were the people who could have written the books, but they're busy saving people's lives. Is it nothing but the truth? I argue, yes. I'm saying this is just anti-computational cognitive neuroscience. In other words, we have the evidence. I wish I could point y'all to books on this, but I know of no serious scholarly literature on this. So sadly, there's no real literature here that I know of in a serious way of what I heard. And the people said up front that they were not the people who would ever write, that they literally were the people in the trenches on this stuff. Is the deceit or truth intended? I argued that the truth is intended. What's the motivation behind the truth is to be informative, I hope. Yes. And what's the social acceptability of the truth or lie? I found this so informative for me that I just said, this is stuff everybody should know about because it's just about truth and lies and how it flows through your life or over you or around you. What label would improve the social acceptability of the truth or lie? I just said this is true. So what I'd like to do is get 30 seconds. By the way, this paper starts with me in the Munich Residence Museum Antiquarium. Have any of y'all been to Munich to this antiquarium? Do any of y'all know about it?
Nope. Nope.
No,
Nope.
haven't heard
Okay,
that.
so if you ever get to Munich, this is a really old museum. It looks like nothing from the outside, but it's been there for 1,000 years. The walls behind me are the emperors of Rome in order with their busts. Most of the busts there of the emperors and the associated people in the Roman Empire of the time, like Cicero. These are the busts that you see. Typically, the originals are underneath. In World War II, the Germans actually, before World War II, the Germans made copies of all the busts and then preserved all the originals that they could, so that when the Allies bombed the place, which they did, this whole room was completely destroyed. They destroyed a bunch of copies of busts and none of the originals. And so they made new copies, just to give you an idea of what this place is. What you're seeing is essentially the entire museum. It's along these walls, and it's an amazing thing. And when you realize that this was the Roman Empire in its heyday, and these are the leaders before Julius Caesar, the leaders after Julius Caesar, the emperors. And so you see what amounts to the cults. I'm going to go ahead with the juror call. Get 20 or 30 seconds from each juror on your summary of your verdict on the thing. So juror one, is juror one here? Juror two?
I'm juror two. With regard to the matter, it's fine. There's nothing inaccurate about this. I don't see how paths of deceit are more powerful than paths of honesty or any other decisive life choice. But with regard to this particular topic, yeah, it makes good sense. And there are probably big lies and little lies that we could follow through forks and decision making to track the course of one's life. I agree that the premise is definitely valid.
Yeah, the specific thing about cults is while truth is there, it's the deceit that drives the cult. What keeps the cult together is the deceit to the external world, the lies that are told to the external world.
Yeah, that's one of the issues.
Fundamental property of a cult.
There's a neat academic branch that specifically studies cults that was
Yes.
outside of the Heaven's Gate cult. It's like UC Santa Barbara or something that's right there, and they're renowned for this.
Actually, one of the UC Santa Barbara guys was there at this
Yeah,
conference. Yeah,
yeah.
heard
Well,
them
Rabbi
for.
Lev Kellerman did a fantastic examination of past lie, present lie, future lie with regard to cults. And so what's interesting is the deceit that's presented to the outside world is not deceit. It's a presentation of faith. And the deceit comes from the leader of the cult to the members of the cult. But it's not necessarily deceit if the leader of the cult, in fact, believes it.
So what they also said was that the cult members will lie to the external world about what the cult is, but there's also lying that goes on to the external world. Trump always tells the truth. I don't know about you, but I've heard people tell me that.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
It's a question of faith. If you believe in what you're telling the rest of the world, it's not actually deceitful. You're just wrong. It's false, but it doesn't make it a lie.
Yeah.
And again, this is breaking it down into semantics that can be discussed another time.
So I say that in the paper. So there are these things called fiat lies, where you may believe something's true when it's actually not true, but the way it got generated because it was false was with an intention to deceive by somebody. It may not be you. Okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, so juror 3.
Hi, Bob. Yeah, it's Mohammed here. Do you need my participant code?
LLM.
Yeah, large language model.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, I didn't get the context of the case. And now that you've explained it from a cult perspective, it made a lot more sense. I'm struggling to agree with that each person has a lifeline through which you can draw paths of deceit. And I just want to qualify that is you could either be part of the deceit or you could be a recipient of the deceit. Is that what you're saying? Because then,
Yeah,
yes.
so it's like the weather, right? So you could have something to do with the weather, like whether or not you have a house over your head, okay, or the weather could do something to you. So it's just like the paths of deceit, or you have a location on the planet at any given moment, and there'll be paths of deceit that are passing over you. So in the case of some of the cases that these guys were worried about were gangs. In fact, this was probably the most common cult that they were concerned with. Small gangs.
Okay, yeah.
30 or 40 kids that were running rampant over neighborhoods, this kind of stuff. And those were cults. There was always, at the right point in time, they always had a leader, and they could run through your neighborhood. That cult could start in Los Angeles and make it all the way up to San Francisco.
Yeah, yeah. And I just wanted to ask something. You mentioned fiat lies and folk lies, and fiat lies are not spoken about. And I just wanted an example of a fiat of a lie.
There are plenty of examples. A fiat lie is, and you actually see it with Trump, is he'll tell a lie and then somebody will challenge him on it and he will say, "You're just a nasty woman." He will not discuss the lie.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So now other people might discuss it, but he's not discussing it. And it was a fiat lie, and it's been turned into a conversational lie by other people, but then the fiat lie still exists within his cult.
Okay, yeah. There's millions of his fiat lies then, yeah.
Sure. In fact, the argument in my original paper, which I think is true, is the printing press first distributed fiat lies on a global basis, actually even local, when the king or the prince or whatever put up signs telling people what the truth was. Those were fiat lies. You could not question those. Yeah. Juror 4.
Yeah, Jervos. I have to say, when I first read your piece, I got confused quite what you meant about paths of deceit. I liked your allegory, though, with the weather, the idea that we're in a kind of ebb and flow of cognitive atmosphere, which with all these different things. And I think that's, yeah, quite a nice idea. But still, there's the question of, Brian brought it up, the question of faith. With faith, you don't have to be cognitively aware of the lie or the truth. You simply just, I've known some Scientologists, and they just have faith. They just had the faith. They didn't want to argue. Arguing didn't have any process in their brains. They just had the faith.
So what's interesting is that one of the papers was on Scientology, or several of the people were involved with studying Scientology. It may have been this California group, but the way they said it was they said that within Scientology, people will talk truthfully with each other, but they will not talk truthfully with the outside world. They'll say things to each other they would never say to the outside, where they're questioning things and so forth and so on.
But that's always assuming that they're aware. They may not even be aware of what is true and what is lie. They've got this emotional connection, and then that's all that matters to them.
Yeah, and I think that's real. One of the things that came out of this thing was there was a general agreement about this, that people who fall into cults are generally pretty intelligent, and they are aware. They just won't be aware to the outside world. They'll be aware among themselves. And so there's both sides of it. There's some people fall into the cult in exactly the way you described. Other people fall into the cult because their brother was in the cult or whatever, but they will become part of the cult because it's protecting them, okay, in some sense. And
yeah, so the fit lie really marks a cognitive threshold, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. It's an interesting thing.
I also thought the piece was quite good in clarifying the verdicts much more. What is the deceit and the difference between folk and fiat, that kind of thing clarifies the way the verdicts have been set up.
One of the reasons I put this one up was this was written in 2019 when the Internet Court of Truth and Lies was invented. And you're seeing one of the papers that was written that actually describes why the verdicts are the verdicts. Juror 5.
Yes, that would be me. I think it's interesting what Brian and also what Andrew said now in relation to faith and on whether or not they regard it as a lie or what. But I was a bit confused and it was a bit fuzzy as to what was going on. And then listening to what you were saying now does put it at an interesting perspective. But then adding more of what Brian asked was now, do they know that it's a lie, even though to the outside world it can be perceived as such? It's interesting to think about.
Yeah, sometimes they don't. But the surprise, the number of people who were in the trenches who have studied these groups at all ages, who said it was completely consent. It was just amazing how everybody agreed that within the cult, people will be very truthful to each other and they know what they are doing. And they know that they don't know that they're in a quote cult, but they know that their leader is the guy to follow, and they know that there are dangers involved in what they're doing, and truth gets them through it, even if the truth is, I will kill you if you say anything to such and such, and then they see that they will kill somebody if such and so. Within the cult, there's much more truthfulness than people give cults credit for. That was one of the things that they noted. I was at the time pretty shocked that there was basically unanimous. It was amazing. And these were people from all over the world who didn't really know each other, all agreeing to that.
What I essentially said was that it doesn't really matter who you are. We all are basically susceptible to being manipulated. We can either be on the providing end or the receiving end of manipulation. So because everyone has a weak point, and it just depends on who's able to exploit that weak point within you, and if you are able to manipulate somebody else as well. So that's basically what I said. And I do agree with you. Yeah.
The thing that I found really interesting is that it is like weather. You can get a storm that passes over an area, and it may last for 20 years in the sense of the cults that get created underneath that storm. It may move on to some other geographic location, and it's basically the same storm. Part of what came out of this was a storm that was successful in creating gangs in one location, could travel across a country and then across countries. And they see this in war and stuff. So that was an interesting property of what these guys were observing. Juror 7.
My summary just basically said, it is true that human beings by nature are capable of both truth and deception. The lifeline metaphor suggests a continuous thread within a person's life, where choices including deceit or honesty branch off like paths. From small white lies to major betrayals, individuals often navigate situations where deception becomes a strategic or emotional response. Psychology acknowledges this through theories of moral development, self-preservation, and situational ethics.
Yep, as usual, somebody said something better than me. Juror 8.
Okay.
To give my summary, I would have to say that I agree that everyone experiences moments of deceit in their life. It is a universal part of the human journey, and everyone sometimes does get manipulated and does sometimes manipulate people. It's always dependent on the situation. Thank you.
Yeah. Did y'all think that this was a nice paper, or was it incomprehensible? And I had no idea. I read it, and of course I wrote it. So I think I like this paper, but I can't tell whether anybody actually. So after I've explained it, did the paper even come close to giving you the idea of what was being talked about? I don't even know.
For me, the confusion was paths of deceit. You seem to use it in a number of different ways. For example, paths of deceit coming to you. Are you traveling on a path of deceit? I just found the illusion a little bit confusing to me.
And yet it's all of the above.
Yeah. Okay.
Because you move over the globe. In the case of these guys, we're talking about a cult leader. The cult can get dissolved in one city, and the cult leader can escape to another city and start the cult there. In other words, it could travel even though it's been extinguished in one geographic area. Brian, what were you going to say?
It's pretty high level, but I think it would have worked a little bit better if you picked examples to illustrate the point or illustrate the various points, because conceptually I follow, but it would have been easier almost to tell it like a narrative based on different lies being told.
Yeah, and I really wish that the president of the university had forced the people at that conference to at least write a page on what each one of them reported, because that was exactly what you're asking for. They were describing these things.
Now, can I pull you in a slightly different direction? What if you have a cult leader who says, my followers, in order to further the goals of the cult, you may lie to the outside world. I encourage it. Lie to the outside world as long as it furthers the goals of the cult. How do you characterize
that's tenet of Muslim faith, by the way.
Yeah, by the way,
it's taqiyya.
No, it's not. No, that's not.
Muhammad's right. Muhammad's right.
It's not true. Please.
It comes from the hadith.
That's far
It
from
doesn't
the
come from
truth.
Quran. Muhammad's right.
The answer is, I think that's a good observation, and also Muhammad's right. There's I don't know how to say this. Again,
it's not an easy topic to cover. It doesn't have a succinct answer. I'm positing it as something to ruminate on.
So what it's for, the paper was really written to get a certain class of sponsor. So I actually wrote this paper, and I got invited out to meet with a billionaire out in California as a result of the paper. And he wanted to know whether or not it addresses, and this killed me getting any of his money. He had a trophy wife, this incredibly beautiful woman. He lives in a castle in California. He wanted to know whether that he and his wife should be considered a cult. And I said,
Cult of
I don't
two?
know what you're talking about. That's what I told him. And I said, maybe. And he said, I think my wife is in my cult. And then she laughed. That was the end of any interest in funding this.
Interesting.
So I blew it. I don't know. I've always wondered what I should have said back to him. It was an insightful comment he was making. But instead I said, I have no idea.
Interesting.
So I said the wrong thing. It was not the smart thing to say. I was not the Elon Musk I should have been. So anyway, so this is good. Oh, and the other thing I didn't mention is that there is a whole thing here about religions, which is really interesting. And you could argue that a religion was originally a cult. Most religions that we have originally started as cults, and they operate like other cults. That's the odd thing here, or at least through parts of their history. Anything as big as the Muslim religion or Christianity or whatever is so big that it's not one thing. We'll see y'all next week.
Well, happy 4th of July tomorrow.
Yeah, happy 4th of July to you.
In the light of that big, beautiful bill.
I've got to have an American flag upside down tomorrow.
Oh, careful.
Yeah.
I'm safe. I'm protected here.
Bye.